Behind closed doors and private flights, a silent circle of influence started to form around Epstein. But silence doesn't erase evidence, it only delays exposure. You see, Epstein didn't just collect friends, he collected secrets. And secrets, in the wrong hands, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. Because why were cameras hidden in every bedroom? Why were teenagers flown from across the world to a private island? And most importantly, why did no one, not presidents, not princes, why did no one speak up? In part 1 of this series, we watched Jeffrey Epstein, Coney Island kid from an average family, rise to an untouchable fixture in elite circles, thanks to money, proximity, and a proverbial set of keys that seemed to open any door. Tonight we step inside the rooms that he controlled, the island, the planes, and the lenses, both obvious and hidden, that turned access into leverage. The big question is easy. What or who was this network for? But the evidence, well, that's not quite so simple. Off the coast of St. Thomas lies Little St. James, Epstein's private island. From the air, it looks idyllic. White sand, turquoise reefs. But according to survivors and court filings, Epstein transformed this paradise into a closely controlled setting for trafficking and abuse.
So it's very private. It's the perfect world for a billionaire getting away with what he was doing. He could hold big parties there and have huge orgies there, and nobody would have any idea what was going on because it was so quiet and so protected.
Epstein acquired Little St. James in 1998 for a little under $8 million under a shell entity called LSJ LLC, which he was the sole member of. Decades later, in December of 2022, the US Virgin Islands announced a $105 million settlement with Epstein's estate for violating anti-trafficking, fraud, and criminal enterprise laws, specifically citing how Epstein used Little St. James as a base for his trafficking ring. Fast forward to May of 2023, and both of Epstein's islands were sold to investor Stephen Deckoff. He apparently has plans to turn them into a resort. Survivors' accounts give us a better idea of what Little St. James really was. Multiple sworn lawsuits and federal complaints describe the island as a place where minors were transported and sexually abused. Virginia Giuffre, for example, testified in a 2016 deposition that Jeffrey Epstein trafficked her to powerful men, naming Britain's Prince Andrew among them, an allegation which Prince Andrew, of course, vehemently denies.
It started with one, and then it trickled into two, and then so on and so forth. And before you know it, I'm being lent out to politicians and to academics and to people royalty.
He later told the BBC Newsnight in a now infamous interview that he had no recollection of Giuffre and awkwardly tried to dispel parts of her story with excuses like having the inability to sweat.
She was very specific about that night. She described dancing with you and you profusely sweating, and that she went on to have a bath, possibly.
There's a slight problem with the sweating. Because I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time, and that was, yes, I didn't sweat at the time because I had suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at, and I simply, it was almost impossible for me to sweat, and it's only because I have done a number of things in the recent past that I'm starting to be able to do that again. So.
In 2022, Prince Andrew settled Giuffre's civil suit out of court with a hefty payment, but no admission of guilt. The settlement and his earlier denials are all public record. Perhaps no image from Little St. James ignited more fevered speculation than the strange blue and white building topped with a golden dome. Online, people dubbed it the Temple, and spun countless theories about what its true purpose could be. Permits and local reporting, however, suggest something far more mundane. Records from 2010 indicate Epstein intended to turn it into a music pavilion, complete with grand piano and acoustic walls. However, the final cube-shaped structure didn't look anything like the initial plans, which fueled even more speculation. But despite internet rumors of underground layers and occult rituals, no hard evidence ties this building to any crimes. Survivor accounts point to abuse happening elsewhere on the island, primarily the main villa and the guest houses, not this creepy little pavilion. The truth is, we have no idea what happened inside of the temple. Short of Tyler Oliveira sneaking onto the island a few years ago, I personally can't find any testimony of any victims being inside of the temple. So if you have been, let me know in the comments. Little St. James wasn't just some remote island. It was deliberately fortified by Epstein's protocols. Court records and investigative reporting described a closed ecosystem. The island's docks were gated and monitored, and Epstein's private staff tightly controlled who came and went. A lawsuit by the Virgin Islands government against Epstein's associates reveal how travel to and from the island was carefully coordinated via the territory's airports and seaports, an infrastructure meant to move people as discreetly as money. Private jets would land on St. Thomas or nearby, and passengers would transfer to Epstein's helicopter or boat to arrive at Little St. James under the radar. Employees were allegedly directed to arrange visas and travel documents for foreign girls, smoothing their entry into the Virgin Islands under false pretenses. In effect, Epstein built a transportation network as insulated as a spy operation. Outsiders couldn't arrive unannounced very easily, and insiders like staff and pilots were a cog in the machine that ensured all the secrecy. The result? Little St. James acted as Epstein's private domain of control. Rooms, staff, and cameras, all entirely at his command. When law enforcement finally raided Epstein's properties in 2019, they uncovered a trove of alarming materials. On Little St. James itself, FBI agents reportedly found rooms outfitted with surveillance cameras and a safe full of hard drives. And at Epstein's Manhattan mansion, agents had to saw open a locked safe tucked away in a dressing room. Inside, they found cash, loose diamonds, an expired passport, and dozens of CDs and hard drives containing photos and videos. Agents carried out boxes of evidentiary media, later logged by the Southern District of New York as hundreds of images and digital files. This is the kind of discovery that supercharges the blackmail theories. The equipment clearly existed to record and archive illicit encounters, yet what's on those tapes remains almost entirely sealed. And apart from a few hints like the newly released Department of Justice Evidence Index, which lists things like one CD labeled Girl Pics Nude, Book 4, and an LSJ logbook, assumingly referring to the island. Things are under wraps. But this wasn't the first time that authorities noticed Epstein's penchant for surveillance. Back in 2005, during the Palm Beach investigation, local police documented a few oddities in his Florida mansion. At least 2 hidden pinhole cameras were discovered hidden within the walls of his home. And they also noted a strict household regimen orchestrated by Epstein's associate Ghislaine Maxwell. A system for scheduling massages for underage girls, and a system that instructed staff to be silent about everything. And all of this foreshadowed the broader pattern that would emerge years later on a much larger scale. The concept of sexual compromat, or compromising material used for blackmail, has a long history. Intelligence agencies and criminal rings alike have used hospitality and hidden cameras to trap targets. Roy Cohn's mid-20th century circle in New York City were rumored to record politicians in compromising acts. And Cold War spycraft routinely implemented honey trap stings. In this story, these tactics are alleged, but not fully proven. Yet. But what should be flagged here is the pattern. Was Epstein running a modernized version of an old playbook? Some journalists like Whitney Webb have argued yes, that Epstein's playbook does mirror those earlier sexual blackmail operations, just on a global scale and possibly with intelligence ties. And we'll be diving more into that theory in part 3 next week. For now, consider the elements we know were present. A private island cut off from prying eyes, a steady supply of vulnerable girls, powerful people coming and going, and surveillance equipment everywhere. So the island wasn't just a hedonistic getaway. It was infrastructure. Epstein's personal jurisdiction, complete with controlled entry points, secret recording systems, and presumably a vault full of secrets. Not to mention a technology footprint that hints at meticulous record keeping by other means. What do those records actually show? Well, that's the fight we're currently in. It's still ongoing. Next, we're going to follow the airways that connected Epstein's world. particularly the Boeing 727 nicknamed by locals in the Virgin Islands the Lolita Express, the name referencing the 1955 novel by Vladimir Nabokov, which, if I describe the plot in too much detail here, will probably get my channel demonetized. But let's just say it's about an inappropriate relationship between a 12-year-old girl and a middle-aged man. So Epstein's fleet included the Boeing 727 as well as several Gulfstream jets. These aircraft stitched together his far-flung realm of depravity from New York to Florida to New Mexico, Paris, London, Tangier, you name it. If Little St. James was the stage, then these planes were the shuttles ferrying players on and off. The flight logs are data. Thousands of data points. Interpreting them responsibly is going to be the challenge. Wired Magazine does a really good video on what this data actually shows us and where these planes were going to and from, and then where they were going after that. So I'm not going to be going over all that in this video, but you can check that out. It's in the description of this video. In the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, prosecutors entered into evidence Government Exhibit 662-RR, a 118-page compilation of Epstein's flights from the 1990s through 2005. On top of that, the FAA, perhaps accidentally, released flight records of Epstein's flights from 2009 to 2019, filling in gaps that the public didn't know about. All told, journalists have compiled a database of 2,618 flights made by Epstein's planes between 1995 and his final arrest in 2019. It's a staggering number. A globe-trotting calendar of where Epstein's aircraft were and when. So, who turns up in these logs? Well, as I'm sure most of you already know, many high-profile figures. According to the records, Bill Clinton took several trips on Epstein's planes. Over a dozen in 2002 to 2003 alone, though most of these were on international charity trips.
Allegations of your connection with Jeffrey Epstein? I think the evidence.
Prince Andrew appears as a passenger at times. So do names like lawyer Alan Dershowitz.
Remember, I was accused falsely on the Epstein, and ultimately I was completely cleared. The woman admitted that she may have mistook me for somebody else and withdrew all of her lawsuits.
I wish there were a client list. That my fondest wish is that there were a client list, because I wouldn't be on it. I wasn't his client. I was his lawyer. He was my client. There was no client list.
False. Look, I had my own experience. I was accused, and then the woman admitted that she may have mistaken me or confused me or misidentified me and withdrew.
Actor Kevin Spacey.
In 2015, I started seeing reports online, things on my Twitter account that I had flown to this guy Jeffrey Epstein's island and I had abused young girls. And I was like, I mean, if you'd asked me in 2015, maybe even if you'd asked me in 2002, did I know a guy named Jeffrey Epstein? I probably would have said no. Well, of course, I have since learned who he is. And I have since been able to go back and find out that the airplane that we flew on for this humanitarian mission was owned by Jeffrey Epstein. And to then learn, oh, he was actually on some of those flights. And this Maxwell woman was on some of those flights. I didn't know him. I've never spent any time with him. I was with the Clinton Foundation people. That's who I was with.
Model Naomi Campbell and even astronaut John Glenn.
He was always front and center at Victoria's Secret shows, and what he's done is indefensible. And when I heard of what he'd done, it sickened me to my stomach, just like everybody else.
It does feel important to note here that Donald Trump is listed on several flight manifests from the 1990s, though these typically were just short hops from Palm Beach to New York, and no flight logs officially have him ever visiting the island.
He was a fixture in Palm Beach. I had a falling out with him a long time ago. I don't think I've spoken to him for 15 years. I wasn't a fan.
To put it plainly, presence on one of Epstein's planes is definitely not proof of a crime, or even evidence that they ever stepped foot onto Epstein's island. And of course, nobody ever knew anything that was going on, and everyone was just hitching a ride. For example, Bill Clinton admits to flying on Epstein's jet multiple times, but he claims to have never visited Epstein's island. And according to the flight logs, that's true. And as I just mentioned, the flight logs clear Donald Trump of ever having visited the island either. One other thing that should be noted here is Epstein had at least 4 pilots. And of those pilots, allegedly, only one of them kept any flight logs. So all of these flight logs, allegedly, are from one of those pilots. So it's entirely within the realm of possibility that many of these people could have been flying to the island just with pilots that didn't keep a log of it. We have no proof of that, obviously, but it is a possibility. But with that being said, I do think it's important to show what the logs definitively show versus what's being sensationalized online. Social media often mischaracterizes these manifests, implying, for instance, that any famous name listed must have been a part of Epstein's crimes. That is a completely unfair assumption. These were private jets, often used like taxis among the rich. Many people probably hitched a ride and had no idea what was going on. Our job is to follow the evidence carefully. Who flew? When? And what independent evidence connects those trips to illegal activity? Earlier this year, in February of 2025, if you followed this case, I'm sure you remember the clown show that was presenting a bunch of right-wing influencers in the White House with the Epstein files, Phase 1. And it resurfaced a lot of what we're discussing today. The flight logs, Epstein's little black book of contacts, evidence lists, but notably, nothing new. Like literally no new bombshells. Every piece of evidence they released in the Phase 1 of the Epstein files was stuff that had been leaked to the internet years ago. It was more of a re-release of known data with heavy redactions to ensure privacy or something. In fact, many observers thought it brought more heat on the administration than anything else. The Streisand effect was trending that day. Just kidding about that part, but the public got reams of raw data to go through, sparking new waves of speculation, but all without any additional context or new unredacted content to draw clear lines from travel to crimes. We saw names and flights, sure, even an FBI evidence list, like the one noting the LSJ logbook or those creepy CDs. But we didn't get any of the crucial pieces that to this day remain sealed. The contents of those logbooks, the videos or photos themselves. It was like getting a puzzle without the picture on the box to base it off of, and with all the most important pieces missing. And this is where survivor testimony becomes so vital. The flight manifests by themselves were just logs of who went where with Epstein. They don't tell us what happened on those trips. To try to get an understanding of the full picture, investigators cross-referenced those logs with victims' accounts. The federal indictment from the Southern District of New York in 2019, for example, laid out a clear pattern. From 2002 to 2005, Epstein sexually exploited and abused dozens of underage girls, often by luring them to his New York or Palm Beach homes for massages that turned into sexual abuse. He described how some of the victims were even paid to recruit other minors, creating a depraved pyramid scheme of abuse. Those facts didn't come from flight logs. They came from witness statements, victim depositions, and law enforcement interviews. Imagine a simple table of truth. On one side, we list a name from the flight logs. Next, the route and the date from the manifest. Next, any independent evidence, a photograph, an entry from Epstein's address book, an email which places that person with Epstein. And finally, whether any allegation or charge arose from that association. In almost all cases, the entry into that last column is going to be no charge, denies allegation. For a few, like Ghislaine Maxwell, it's convicted of trafficking. But Maxwell was also deeply involved in operating the scheme, not just a passenger. For others like Clinton and Trump, it's no charges, denies wrongdoing. For Prince Andrew, it's sued in civil suit, settled without liability. This kind of cross-checking is how we as responsible media consumers sort through these flight logs without jumping to conclusions. Bottom line for the planes, they established Epstein's reach. They show how far and wide his influence or allure extended, and just how many VIPs at least crossed paths with him. But the logs are just the start of the story, not the end. It takes evidence from outside of those planes. The survivors' testimonies of being trafficked, corroborating photographs like that infamous 2001 photo of Prince Andrew with his arm around 17-year-old Jeffrey, and physical evidence from searches to transform a flight record into a case. But now let's focus on the cameras, the surveillance, and the theory that Epstein's endgame was blackmail, also known as compromat.
Gathering of compromat is one of the primary working methods of the Russian intelligence agencies. This technique is systematically used in Russia, and I have no doubt that it's already used and will be used to achieve the Kremlin's foreign policy goals.
The evidence on this front is intriguing. As mentioned, Palm Beach police in 2005 found 2 hidden cameras inside of Epstein's Florida home, which immediately raised eyebrows. Why would a private residence need secret recording devices? Jump ahead to 2019 in New York, and the FBI finds racks of electronic storage media inside of Epstein's townhouse. Agents recovered dozens of recording devices, computers, hard drives, and memory sticks. We're talking video footage, photos, audio, who knows? And recall, Epstein's staff wasn't supposed to say anything about Epstein's guests. During Maxwell's trial, a former housekeeper testified that the entire staff received a 58-page instruction manual from Maxwell herself. In it, Maxwell admonished employees. Remember that you see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing except to answer a question directed at you. They were to never discuss what happened with Epstein's guests and respect their privacy at all costs. One rule read, never disclose Mr. Epstein's or Miss Maxwell's activities or whereabouts. In other words, it was a culture of absolute silence, and discretion was enforced. To put it bluntly, you don't accumulate that many nude photos, secret videos, and classified contact lists without a reason. And the logical why behind Epstein's surveillance is the blackmail thesis. The idea that Epstein was collecting leverage over the rich and powerful. So the working theory goes that the hospitality was the bait. The hidden cameras was the hook, and the tapes was the catch. Guests were allegedly entertained with underage girls, the encounters were secretly recorded, and Epstein would then have incriminating evidence sitting in his safe. But what could he do with it? Possibly ensure loyalty or silence or favors later. Now, I have to stress that this is just a theory, but it's rooted in some pretty concrete evidence, and it's bolstered by patterns throughout history. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that such a scheme existed. In US political history, Roy Cohn, the notorious power broker and political fixer of the 1970s and 80s, was long rumored to have run a ring that procured minors for influential men and recorded the encounters. Effectively a sexual blackmail operation, protecting his clients and giving him influence.
Here's how to cause a fuss at a gathering of American judges or lawyers or just thoughtful people. Merely say the name Roy Cohn. People will leap at you with allegations against the man going back to his association with Joe McCarthy. Some sheer invention, some true but unprovable, and a lot that's true and proven. Among the current allegations, that it was Roy Cohn who started the rumor that Hamilton Jordan used cocaine at the Studio 54 disco. He denies he started it. That Cohn is the secret beneficiary of a number of dubious cash-only businesses. Cohn denies it. You will get very few people to praise or even defend Roy Cohn. Many, if not most, regard him as something of a snake.
We've seen Roy Cohn twice. What have we seen? A person of great charm, intellect, misstatement, accomplishment, and hypocrisy.
Do not be deceived. Regard this as a friendly introduction of Cohn at New York Law School. Professor Bob Blecker prepares his students for a series of Roy Cohn lectures.
Mr. Cohn is a person who thinks very little of truth, but much of genuineness. He's a master of deception, and yet a detester of ceremony. A nice guy who's done and does some lousy things. A protector, a paladin, a friend in court of organized crime.
In the Cold War era, both Soviet and Western intelligence agencies used honey trap tactics, seducing targets and photographing them to extort information or cooperation. And Webb's book argues that Epstein was essentially plugged into that tradition. That Epstein's activities were not just a private vice, but part of intelligence-linked programs to compromise powerful individuals. She points out the echoes of earlier cases and suggests that Epstein's ring was modernized and globalized compromise, potentially involving multiple intelligence agencies.
I basically feel like I pretty convincingly show in my book that there's a lot of baton passing going on between the generations. So like my book starts in the 40s, and I follow a lot of these institutions and people through the years. So, you know, I talk a lot about how a figure named Roy Cohn, who was Donald Trump's mentor, and how he passed a lot of things on to Trump. How a lot of people that were in Cohn's network got involved with Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell hired them when he came to the U.S., including figures like Robert Keith Gray, that were PR executives on their face, but also tied to the CIA, involved in sex blackmail, and how they, you know, got involved with Maxwell's entry into New York City, which is how, you know, mainly how Ghislaine got so enmeshed in New York society, and also, you know, teamed up with Epstein in that same period of time. So, you know, all of this matters, and these connections are significant.
Now, this is analysis, not proof, but it is a provocative interpretation of the known facts. And we will explore those intelligence connections more deeply through the lens of Ghislaine Maxwell's family in next week's episode. Here's what's not speculation. Key evidence remains sealed. We know the FBI seized all those CDs and hard drives in 2019, but nearly all of their contents remain unsealed or entirely undisclosed to the public. No videos have leaked. No smoking gun photos of VIPs caught in the act have been released from official sources. Recently, the DOJ's partial release gives us an index of what was taken, like that Girls Pics CD label, but not the actual photos or videos. And I understand that we will never see photos or videos of victims having crimes committed against them, and that's completely understandable. But we don't even have the details of who appears in these videos, when and where these videos were made. Some material was shown to Ghislaine Maxwell's defense and obviously prosecutors. Some was likely shared with attorneys for victims. But for the general public, it's still a black box. We're left with tantalizing clues, but without the ability to open it and read the names. The unanswered questions are incredibly frustrating. Who was on those tapes? Who was keeping them organized? Was Epstein collecting dirt for himself, or was someone else, a handler perhaps, pulling the strings? It's exactly the thread we're going to be following into part 3. If Epstein's operation was about leverage, we have to ask, leverage for who? Who actually benefited from all of this? Let's examine the outcomes we can point to. For one, the authorities in the US Virgin Islands have literally cashed in on Epstein's crimes after the fact. They sued Epstein's estate, framing Little St. James as the epicenter for a criminal enterprise. And in 2022, they reached a $105 million settlement with the estate. They also secured half the proceeds from the eventual sale of Little St. James and additional funds for environmental damage that Epstein did to Greater St. James. The money is allegedly being directed to victim assistance programs and law enforcement funds in the Virgin Islands, effectively reclaiming some of Epstein's fortune for public good. Then there are the banks that enabled Epstein. In 2023, JP Morgan Chase, which was Epstein's primary bank for years, agreed to pay $290 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by victims of Jeffrey Epstein. The lawsuit had exposed how JP Morgan executives had overlooked many of Epstein's red flags due to being a lucrative client. Around the same time, JP Morgan also settled separately with the US Virgin Islands for around $75 million. That lawsuit alleged that JP Morgan had turned a blind eye to Epstein's trafficking operation. Deutsche Bank, which took on Epstein after JP Morgan finally dropped him, likewise paid $75 million in a settlement with victims. All told, hundreds of millions of dollars have been paid out by Epstein's estate and his financial facilitators. These payouts are not admission of personal guilt in Epstein's crimes, but they are consequences of proximity. In essence, the cost for being associated with Epstein, even indirectly, has been very high for these institutions. So that's the money side. But what about the intangible currency here? Silence. There is a very wide gap between what we suspect and what can actually be proven in court. The flight logs show a roster of elites, and the victims describe years of abuse involving some of these elites. Yet to date, only Epstein and Maxwell have been criminally charged for the actual trafficking. No high-profile clients of Epstein have been named by prosecutors as co-conspirators or defendants. It's almost like an inverse pyramid, a huge base of allegations and evidence pointing upward to nobody else, officially. And this could be for many reasons. Lack of sufficient admittable evidence, statute of limitations issues, or the fact that many powerful individuals simply didn't cross that line into criminal territory. But many observers believe the silence was the point, that Epstein's ultimate product was protection. People in his orbit might be protected from scandal so long as they stay in line and perhaps did favors in return. It's a hard thing to quantify, but consider. Epstein secured a shockingly lenient plea deal in Florida in 2008. And even after his 2019 arrest, there were rumors of a client list that could blow the lid off of many powerful careers. As of just a few months ago in 2025, the Justice Department pronounced that no evidence exists of some big client list, and they wouldn't be pursuing further charges. True or not, that announcement only fueled more skepticism. Let's illustrate the theory. Epstein invites the rich and famous to his properties. Think private island parties, excursions on the jet. Some of those guests engage in illicit sex acts with minors, who were coerced or trafficked there. Epstein's surveillance system captures it. Now he holds a form of power over those individuals, which he could use to extract favors, secure investments or donations, or simply ensure that they never speak out against him. In intelligence terms, this would be a classic honey trap compromat operation, updated for the 21st century, of course. Again, this is a model. Okay? We do not have some public smoking gun document where Epstein wrote, "Dear diary, today I compromised so-and-so." We do have Maxwell's trial evidence of the Little Black Book, of contacts, code words, and the sheer fact that Epstein cultivated many ties with influential figures in science, finance, politics, and even philanthropy. Now, was he cashing in those favors? Well, it's suggestive, but not confirmed. In short, a lot of the famous names listed in Epstein's logs were completely ignorant to Epstein's dark side. And it's possible some truly were. Online, unfortunately, the nuance gets lost. So-and-so was on the plane, therefore they are a pedophile, is not how this works, and is a huge leap that responsible reporting does not make. We stick to so-and-so was on the plane on these dates. So let's recap tonight's segment. The planes gave Epstein access, or a way to bring people into his world. The island provided control, a private place where rules didn't apply. The cameras and surveillance implied retention of something. Evidence, perhaps? What's missing here is the element of direction. Who was orchestrating this system and to what ultimate end? Epstein alone? Or were there others behind the scenes using Epstein as a conduit? To pick up that trail, we go to the one person who was by Epstein's side through it all. Ghislaine Maxwell. And beyond Ghislaine, the story of her father, Robert Maxwell, a man whose life was steeped in intrigue and espionage. Because sometimes to understand a chapter in history, you have to go back and read the chapter before it. Next week in part 3, we'll see how intelligence ties and family legacy converge in the Epstein saga.